The opposite of security is insecurity, and the only way to overcome insecurity is to take risks. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this debate. Standing in front of you here is Muhammad Kabir Khadija from Team Kazana, Nigeria, and I stand here with zeal, fortitude, strong reasons, and cogent facts to propose the fact that this House believes that it is in Putin's interest to pull out troops in Ukraine. Let's look at the burden of proof of today's government, which is firstly, problems of Putin pulling troops into Ukraine, which cause security threat and the many issues on the global world. But before I go deeper into my argument, I would like to establish the argument by the Deputy Prime Minister Kofi Ibrahim Amina, who will rebut, counter-attack, shed more light, and indeed give cogent facts on why we are proposing this motion, while finally my whip, who will clarify the context of the debate and provide rebuttals. Secondly, our compelling case, by both sides. Straight to my point, members of this House, I would like to start by a brief history of Putin and Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is a president of Russia, which when we look into the deep ocean of history, Ukraine is part of Russian Empire for centuries. However, the nation got its independence after the disintegration of the Union Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, in 1991, which made Ukraine gain its fully independence. After the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, which is considered as a catastrophe that robbed Russia of its rightful places among the world's greatest powers. This is the brief history and the relationship of Russia and Ukraine. Since that very time, a deal was signed that NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, will not join the West. But the breakup of this agreement is what influenced a war between Russia and the Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, looking at the interest of Russian leader, that is Vladimir Putin, to pull out his troops out of Ukraine, which is for the betterment of Ukraine. As he said, and I quote, "It is not our plan to occupy the Ukraine territory. We did not intend to enforce war on anyone." Therefore, we can clearly understand that it is not the interest of Vladimir Putin to impose war on Ukraine. This is the fault of Ukraine. Why? This is because a deal was signed that Ukraine should not join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization since they get their independence. But the Ukraine broke up this agreement and joined North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is NATO. And this is a serious security threat to Vladimir Putin's country. So he has to do what he wants and wish in order to protect his country. Therefore, we can clearly understand that it is in his interest to pull out of Ukraine, or to pull out his troops out of Ukraine. Seeing the fall of the Soviet Union as the disintegration of Russia, of the historical Russia, that is what he stated. We can clearly understand that the pull out of Ukraine, not bearing to see thousands, we can clearly understand that Vladimir Putin is willing to pull out of Ukraine because he is not bearing to see death of thousands of people, bombardment and killing thousands of people, but he is forced to do so. But the thing here is that the initial aim was to overrun Ukraine and depose its government, and then for good, it deserved to join the West. The US and much of the Europe are on side of Ukrainians. They believe that Ukraine should decide what should be done by itself. Therefore, we can clearly understand that they are staring at the war drugs. They are just that influence and cause this war, but later on, they stay up there and telling Ukraine to decide what should be done by itself. Therefore, we can clearly understand that it is not in Putin's interest, that is the president of Russia, to pull in his troops into Ukraine, but his interest is to pull out his troops out of Ukraine. So therefore, we can clearly understand that the European Union and the NATO are at the center of this situation. So it's Russia's interest to pull in their troops into Ukraine, but he is forced to do so. His interest is to pull out of Ukraine. It was putting pressure on Ukraine pro-Russian leader. It causes malnutrition, causing about 1.5 to 5 billion people to starvation. This was reported by Food Security and by Food Security and Nutrition and a global report on food cases. This was the main fact that why Vladimir Putin should pull out his troops out of Ukraine, because as the slack hand caused poverty, the diligent makes rich. A child who gathers in summer is prudent, but a child who sleeps in harvest brings shame. On the contrary, let's look at the situation the world is in because of this situation. Because of this situation, Putin pulling into Ukraine, providing almost 15% of the world's wheat and 16% of the world corn in general, providing most of the countries to break down that have been brought down by the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's take a simple example with most African countries who depend on those countries in order to gain who depend on those countries by the supply of wheat and 10% the suppliers of oils. Therefore, we can clearly understand and see the reasons on why Vladimir Putin should pull out of Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, members of this house, looking at this situation, we can clearly understand that members of this house, looking at this situation, we can clearly understand that Vladimir Putin should pull out of Ukraine. This is because thousands of people are killed, environment have been demolished, bombardment, innocent lives of children have been killed, and many others. Therefore, we can clearly understand that this motion must stand. At this very juncture, I'm proof to propose. Thank you.
Now let's invite the leader of the opposition to get the speech.
My name is Emma. I go by she, they. In any case, I think I'll be taking 1 before 6, so you can just interrupt me. Right. But I'll be asking for PIs as well. If Putin was such a benevolent actor, I think he would have been the people who is actually going to protect human rights. He would be the person that is going to respect territory sovereignty. But this is also the same man that believes in expansionist policies, because he thinks he is somebody that is actually capable of being entitled to actually reclaim these territories in Ukraine. And I don't think this is the actor that actually wants to pull out of his people from these places where he wants to reclaim these territories, right? I think it's a major thing that's coming from Gulf. is not actually proven, why is it possible that Putin is going to do so? I think like two things that I will clarify before I go on to my setup, right? And number one, when it comes to like whether Putin is a benevolent actor, I think like I'm also going to clarify why as a strongman he has way more expansionist policies. Number one, I think number two, he's also not willing to actually back down his troops because he still believes in the possibility of him actually reclaiming these territories in the first place. I think number two, the problem also came out that side government was trying to say, side government is also trying to say as if like, oh, right now the only reason why for some reason like Russia doesn't want to like Russia wants to pull out his troops and actually thinks that Ukraine is a bad person is only because like for some reason like they were pulling out of NATO. But in the first place, NATO was created because of trying to go up against the Soviet Union, which is right now it's Russia. So in the first essence, this is already like a wrong fact in itself. We say to you that Ukraine never been in NATO in the first place. So I don't think this contention is actually true coming from Gulf. I think number two is that when they say that, oh, like right now, a lot of countries or states are also dependent on Russia, which I think is also a false narrative because essentially well, maybe there are a few states that are dependent on the allies of Russia, but not Russia per se. I will talk to you why later, like even in the current status quo, a lot of incentive is there in order for Russia to continue on the war, and we don't think he's going to pull out his troops soon. So if I go on, yes, okay.
Don't you think that operation to Putin pulling out his troops from Ukraine is just like Putin, the killing of people under the clock of war, which is nothing but an act of murder? Please address the house.
Yeah, so I think right now it's essential for you to understand why he would be willing to do murder because he doesn't like actually care as much about the people on the ground being lost. He's the person who is willing to do anything in order to win the war. I will tell you why that is the incentive that's going to do so. I think first off, what is the metric of this debate? We tell to you it doesn't actually mean like we're not going to tell to you why is it likely that he's going to win the war or not. The metric here is only to tell you whether it is within his best interest to do so. So we have to provide to you like a trend analysis whether this is something that he's going to do, whether he's going to forego his principles, and that is the burden of side government to prove us that he's going to do so. We tell to you the counterfactual now is that he will continue on the war. He will be sending in his troops still, and we don't think he's going to revoke his stand when it comes to the war right now in Ukraine, right? So two arguments to bring to this. Number one, when it comes to the principle, we say to you that he is spearheading a strongman regime, right? So three levels to understand this. Number one, understand that why as a strongman authority he will not be backing down. Number one, I understand that it's less likely for him to accept the narrative that is imposed on him on actually being even like a war criminal in the first place. He doesn't care. Even if like the global even if the international organizations are actively condemning him, he doesn't care. That in itself is something that means that he doesn't actually care about like foregoing his stance in the first place, because we don't think like the possibility of like other like outsiders narrative is something that's important to him. What's important to him is the narrative that is like strong and ongoing within his own state, whether it's Russia, right? I think like he doesn't want to back down also because he thinks that it will make him look weak. The reason being is that when you pull out troops, that means you are actually giving into the idea that your opposite, that Ukraine is essentially going to win the war. And as a strongman regime, I don't think this is something that he will be likely be doing, right? Because you don't want to make yourself look weak in the eyes of like international bodies or your allies, or also like strongly is within like your local authorities, right? But it also means that the strategy is also to prolong the war so long that even if like people on the ground are going to lose, it doesn't really matter, because as long as he keeps on actually gaining some force of trust within his people and also to the troops, it means that he's way more likely to make people accept the fact that he is not going to back down in the war and not going to pull out the troops out of Ukraine. But the second level is why we tell to you it is also within his favor the current situations now. We understand that there are two circumstances to this. Number one is that the economic sanctions are actually working, in that when they actually were capable of filling out the ports at Odessa and actually restricted from vessels from coming in and out from Odessa, it meant that at the end of the day, Russia was the only actor that was capable of letting the grain trade to actually keep on moving. That means economic sanction is something that is actually working on his end. And then number two, a lot of states in the Ukraine is generally one of the major providers of grain trade, and that is something that's very much important for for the food trade, right? But that is number one. Number two is in terms of the gas, right? Gas is something that's very is very essential, especially when you talk about the European circuit, because it's very dependent on Russia. And a lot of people in Russia, a lot of like states in Europe and basically the EU are very dependent on Russia for gas, especially for energy, especially for electricity, right? Like Russia understands now that a lot of people are actually like having to work into their end or into their favor to not actually cross the lines when it comes to them, because it means that they are the only people that can actually provide resources when it comes to like gas, and also providing for electricity to happen in the first place. But also understand that they are also garnering support politically from the Eastern Bloc. This looks like countries such as Belarus. This looks like countries from the far right that are having far right politicians, i.e. like Poland and also Hungary, that believe in the idea of like trying, as people who are outcasts and also isolated in the EU, trying to gain support from Russia at the end of the day. But what is my second argument, panel? So in terms of pragmatic level, if they actually pull out these troops, it will be demoralizing for his own people. 3 levels to this. Number one, if they do, Putin understand he is a populist leader. That means that he needs the faith of the people in order for him to continue being in power. What does this mean? He needs the people that's going to fuel his nationalistic agenda and actually gain the support of these people, which are the army. We think that the second level here is to understand that it's very demoralizing because their leader doesn't believe in them. Why would then they would actually want to have Putin to still be in power? Putin doesn't want to do this because he generally doesn't want to get any form of resentment when it comes to his own people or from the army themselves. I think that lastly, in the long run, the comparative here is that not only does it hurt the morale of his own military, but it also means that it's going to hurt Putin's reputation. We don't think then that on the comparative here on Gulf, comparative here on ARC, is that we don't think they're actually going to pull out his troops, because essentially this means that it's going to hurt his reputation in the long run. For these reasons, we take this debate.
We know opposition will speak. Now let's invite the Deputy Prime Minister to speak. Please, sir.
A true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him. The panel, all protocols duly observed, welcome from today's proposition. I am Ibrahim Amina Kurfi, and I'm the Deputy Prime Minister for the government. Before proceeding to my argument, I need to address the proposition side. Addressing the Prime Minister from the opposition, and also the opposition claimed that Putin is going to do anything to win war, anything that will happen, it just don't care, but it was just not right. Yeah, Putin does a lot, but he does it for his people. Putin does it for the people he rules. Besides, the world telecommunication closed to Russia in Ukraine. Sanctions were laid on Russia. A lot of things were put onto Russia on the table, and nobody ever cared. All they did was just to face Ukraine and call it the victim, but it is the aggressor. It was Russia who is the victim, and it still is. All the sanctions that are laid, nobody said anything, nobody did anything. All they claimed was that Ukraine is the victim and Russia aggressed it. And you still call Putin a person who doesn't consider anything, only cares about what he likes. That is not good. Also, the opposition may claim that Putin acted in a barbaric manner in the first place and called on a war, but it is not so. Why? Because Putin didn't want to start a war in the first place. He had no choice. Ukraine isn't the victim, but rather the aggressor. Ukraine has breached the Minsk Protocol by attempting to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Ukraine also was at fault because it wanted to send away troops that are staying in the land first owned by Russia, which was given to them after the Cold War. So also Ukraine is at fault. The proposition may claim that Ukraine can actually join NATO, but it is a threat to Russia because it has been long-lasting war between the Soviet Union and the then West. The Ukraine knew this, and I believe it just wanted to cause the war in the first place, all under the United States' influence. Even in the start of the war, the Ukraine's foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister, made mention that they wanted to sit on table and discuss with Ukraine, but Ukraine was procrastinating under the United States influence and not wanting to talk. and just look at it in a deeper perspective and see the need for Russia to protect itself. This is war between the rule of law and the rule of God. This is the war between the Hawks of the East and the West of the Shreks of the West. Putin didn't want to deploy troops to Ukraine, but he needed to. And so now he's planning to pull his troops out of Ukraine because of it is in his interest. The POI.
The one who started the conflict was Russia. Please clarify as to how Ukraine is the person instigating the conflict in the first place. Clarify.
Russia started the war for protection. As we all know that defense is the best form of attack. Russia was actually just trying to protect itself because Ukraine breached the Minsk Protocol and wanted to join NATO, as of course they had the signed agreement when the Soviet Union collapsed that they could not join NATO. So by doing that, it is creating a security threat to Russia, because if the NATO build their military base there, we all know what is going to happen. A typical example of how America invaded Cuba and called it the Pig Bay Invasion War back then before the Cold War. So we all know that if NATO builds a military base there, definitely Russia will be at risk. So Russia protected itself. Thank you. Back to my own argument, the opposition may claim that Putin was forced to take his troops out of Ukraine, but it is quite wrong. Why? Because Putin is powerful and of course has many allies, and their enforcement could lead to a third world war. We can see China, North Korea, and of course these allies will not stop until they support Russia 100%. And when we do that, we all know what is going to happen. United States of America will just pull back. If they pull back, they did that in Afghanistan, Israel, to mention among others, and they left them with no sovereign government, all suffering because of United States influence. And Ukraine is still going behind it. This is not good. Saying that Putin's interest is not to pull out his troops in Ukraine seems just not right, because Putin is not forced. He is rigid in his actions. In many occasions, Putin made it quite clear in many of his speeches, and I quoted one of these, that he said Ukraine and Russians, he sees them as one and didn't want to hurt any of them. But guess what? They called for it. Also, threats to Russia, because it's been a long-lasting war. Also, even the flip is that actually Putin's interest, it is Putin's interest to pull out the war because he cared for his country and did this as a form of defense. He didn't want to hurt anybody, but they wanted to hurt him. Even if Russia is all pressured on, everyone is on it, people are turning against it, closing to it, countries helping Ukraine is quite insignificant. This is not correct. This is because the world and the people want to save Ukraine, right? Well, yeah, they do. But saving these will also put the Russians in danger, because they are not considering Russians as people. They are only fighting with Putin. This is a war that is coupled with a nation's interest, and that of the destinies of a nation, coupled with the interests of individuals. If you want to protect people, if you want to support people, you have to stop your own interests and think about what you will do to others and how it will hurt other people, not only what you're interested in. That is it. Comparing this, we see how clear and certain it is that we need to see how Putin was also protecting his people and not only his own interest. We understand that if Putin did not deploy his troops in Ukraine, the military bases of NATO will deploy their own and they will hurt Russians. So that is it. This means that Vladimir Putin is putting troops out of Ukraine based on interest and based on force. Vladimir Putin is putting his troops out of Ukraine because he was not fighting Ukraine in the first place. Ukraine was under the Soviet Union after all. He was only doing it to protect his people. And we can understand that the opposition may claim that he said that the Nazification and the militarization of Ukrainians was a false threat. But I tell you, it is not false. We see a typical of what happened when they wanted to migrate from Ukraine. There were discrimination. There were racist claims. They only said that they were going to deploy women out of the country, and later they joined the white men and left the black. Even the United Kingdom was a witness of that. Even the United Kingdom was aware of that. You can't be plotting evil in my veranda and expect me to throw away a panic. We are now in a civilized age, a civilized society. Man must not eat his fellow man in order to survive. Any act or policy against humanity is archaic, barbaric, unspeakable, redundant, and a great sign of incompetency from the policymakers. So whatever is making Ukraine and the Western world be so callous to humanity shall be outrightly condemned. My argument is proven, all my point contradicting the team opposition worthy. If I continue, the drive will be too long, the seats too few, the people too many. At this very point, I prove to propose. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Hasbul. No preferred gender pronouns. Verbal POIs. Okay, starting my speech. In 3, 2, 1. It is unfortunate of all of the atrocities that are happening in Ukraine. However, recognize that it was unstrategic for a proposition not to characterize what are the interests as well as the incentives of Putin. But number two, it was also unstrategic for them not to engage with the material coming from Emma, particularly her argumentation about the principle on how we're going back against the strongman image that Putin has set up for himself, as well as how it harms the Eastern Bloc countries. But secondly, as to how does this demoralize the army of Russia itself. So in this speech, a few things. Firstly, I'm going to have a few pieces of framing which I think need to be fixed. Secondly, I have three responses going to side proposition, and thirdly, I'll have an argument talking about why will this harm the international interests of Putin as a whole. But firstly, let's take a look at a few pieces of reframing, right? So understand, proposition failed to tell us what were Putin's interests in the first place. Number one, understand that Putin was living in an era of the Kremlin whereby he's more likely to be paranoid, right? And number two, understand that he has norms that he already that he already has the norms as well as the interest to conquer Ukraine in order to further hinder NATO's interest within Ukraine in the first place. No, thank you. But thirdly, and I think it's much more important, is the expansionist regime that Putin has, right? Understand, so as a proposition, their burden to prove in this debate was to prove to us why is abandoning this expansionist regime in the best interest of Putin. In the first place, they never had any levels of analysis to prove to us why this is the case. Because understand that in the instant that he does abandon this regime, he's literally abandoning everything that he stands for as a politician and also as an international leader in international politics, right? Secondly, my responses. So firstly, to Prime Minister. So the entire argumentation coming from PM was a little bit funny as to how he said that Russia was forced to do this because NATO was going into Russia, and that he did not want to do this, and he was coerced into this decision. I think that number one, this is even in their best case, right? Number one, this is factually untrue. But in the instance that it is true, and him pulling out these troops makes him look more like a hero, and war suddenly stops, right? Understand the point in which the point in which that he is forced to take out his troops, the point in which he removes his troops from Ukraine in first place. I don't think that he will not hinder any grudges, right? I don't think that there is no possibility of him wanting to. There is no possibility, or there is a high possibility of him wanting to continue this expansionist regime in some other way, which could be even more harmful in the future. But before that, yes, go ahead.
Please, with a die elucidification, critically explain to the House the separation to today's motion will be just like opposing the plans of the mind which belongs to mortals and the answer of the tongues which belongs to the Lord.
Okay. putting aside all of those idioms and rhetorics, understand that this debate is particularly about Putin's best interest, right? So yes, it is abhorrent that Ukrainians are dying. I understand this, but the spirit of this motion is to debate in Putin's interest. All right. My second response, so now moving to Deputy Prime Minister, right, and as to how she characterized that Ukraine is the aggressor in this instance. Number one, this is factually incorrect because the one who started this was Russia in the first place. They literally announced the expansionism overnight, so I don't think that they are the aggressor. But number two, but number two, right? Even if this is true, let's say that Russia is the aggressor in this instance. I think that number one, it is justified for Ukraine to want to be the aggressor in the first place because Russia started it. And I think that it is justified for Ukraine it is justified for Ukraine to pursue the membership of NATO in the first place. But understand that this argument works against them also because if the premise of their argument in this instance is to say that it is in Russia's interest to self-defend themselves, therefore it is also in Russia's interest it is also in the interest of Putin to keep his troops within Ukraine, which is in order for him to self-defend Russia as well, right? Because the moment in which he pulls out these troops and he tells them to come back is the point in which that they literally lose a territory. So I don't understand how do they get self-defense either way. My last response is to how they say, in the instance that Russia does pulls out its troops, that's the point in which that the Ukrainians on the ground are going to go in and attack Russia. Number one, I don't think that this is true because this is true. Firstly, because Russia started the conflict. But number two, I don't think that the Ukrainians on the ground are going to be completely irrational and stoop down to Russia's level and suddenly attack Russians. I know that the Prime Minister of Ukraine was a former comedian. So please don't make jokes, right? So now, my first argument as to why this is the best interest of Putin in the first place. Number one, why does this harm Putin's best interest? So Emma has already told you, right? Because as I told you, that this is literally a retraction of his stances because now he's going to be perceived as an inconsistent leader and it's going to harm his strongman stances and understand that within the international community, this is the light that they're going to paint him now, right? Number two, it solidifies all of the backlash that Russia has already been incurred towards Russia, right? All of the narratives saying that Russia is an instigator, Putin is a man of war, is going to be solidified when he has to admit defeat by pulling these troops out, right? So understand what, but the unique thing that you need to understand is how does this hurt them internationally. Firstly, recognize the alliances that Russia has. So in countries like Russia, where they have actively supported Putin's expansionism, they've actively told them that yes, we support this regime, and they have actually endorsed Russia, and they have has supported the Russian government in actually colonizing Ukraine, right? How does this hurt them internationally? Because the point in which that Russia pulls out and Putin pulls out these troops is the point in which that all of the actors like China are going to look bad, right? Because they're going to be deemed as the actors that supported an unnecessary regime, that supported a war, that supported a losing battle. Therefore, the point in which this happens is the point in which that they're going to lose countries like Russia, they're going to lose these alliances, and China in itself will face backlash as well. But understand why is this interest important? Because understand number one how it harms Russia's further interest, right? Because number one, you are harming Putin's particular nationalist and populist regime, and number two, his political influence on the ground will reduce as well. But number two, the reason as to why he needs this international support is number one in the future is for him to get further support as well. If he pulls out his troops from Ukraine at this moment, it's the point in which that he is going to lose his support because now he won't be trusted by his allies. Right? But number two, recognize that Russia has already incurred many losses from this war in the first place. So the point in which that you actually the trade-off that they are willing to accept is that they are willing to defend human lives, but they are willing to let Russia suffer because of all the losses in the war. So with that, never be harder to oppose. Thank you.
Government will provide them. Thank you.
That's which one?
The object of war is not to die for a poor country, but to make the other bastard die for his, but yet have interests that will save him just to exploit in terms of power. All Portugal's observe good day to you all. Welcome to this side of the house. And I stand here firmly with no hesitation, purposely to propose the motion that this House believes that it is in Putin's interest to deploy out his troops out of Ukraine. But I, being the whip of today's argument, there are three things I will be doing as a whip. Firstly, I will clarify the context of the debate and provide rebuttals. Secondly, our compelling case both by both sides on why we win today's argument. But before I proceed into my arguments, there are some things about the proposition speech that need to be addressed. They are addressing the government who says that not willing to pull out his troops initially, not willing to pull out his train initially, which that can serve but for betterment. Yes, we can clearly understand that for Putin to pull out his train out of Ukraine is the betterment for all, rather not the solution. Because not pulling troops will affect all. Why? Because war is vile and despicable, says by Putin. I should rather be turned to sweat than be a part of so base an action. I think that it is based on policies of all other people that we should not engage ourselves in a war. That's why we think it is the betterment of all that Putin should pull out his troops out of Ukraine. Addressing the government who says that will make him look weak. It seems like the OAP are using personal information and not considering the impact of this to the world. And according to the Baton fallacy rule, committed to call appeal to personnel, that is using personal information, not thinking about how this will affect other people of the world. So this point should not be considered in today's argument. They also state a point that many EU nations oppose to Putin and other countries. We can clearly understand that this can lead to the eve of the Third World War. This is the war between two polar sets of values. If this was to continue, we don't know where this might take us. We don't know what this might expect. We don't know the future because we should indeed, Putin should indeed pull out his train out of Ukraine in order for the betterment of all generations. They also state a point that how abandoning this will cause problems and more that supports our side the best, as says by the Deputy Prime Minister of the opposition. But what I want you to understand here is that I will explain deeply in terms of this. They also state a point that incorrect that Russia started this war, but specifically, where is the war kept? That no countries will join NATO. Yes, that is after the break of the USSR in 1991. That a note was kept. That all other countries in Russia, such as Ukraine itself, Russia, Latvia, Lithuania, all will not join countries of NATO or of the West. But what is happening is that Ukraine is trying to join this NATO, that is the North Treaty Atlantic Organization of the West. So we can clearly understand that. Why? This is because Putin have given a warning hand, but at the other hand, one must pay for his crime because Ukraine have not heed the word. Why? This is because when a nice man loses his temper, even the devil shivers. And that is what's happening. That is what is happening. Members of this house, moving on to my own arguments, we can clearly understand that even if it had to be in Putin's interest, why? Because the leader's initial aim was to overrun Ukraine and deposit its government. And then its good desire of joining NATO, the West Defensive Alliance NATO. Why? Because Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke of freeing Ukraine from operations, while Foreign Intelligence Chief Shagnashkin argues that Russia's future and its future place in the world are at stake. Why? To give direct response, the impact to say both Putin and the ex-comedian into the peace, while to oppose this as the opposition may explain that this can even lead to the eve of the Third World War. Sri Lanka, in a point of no return that even the great Gotabaya Rajapaksa had given up his has given up his position as the president. Countries like Turkey in tortures because of hunger and starvation. We can clearly understand that the prices of food is unavailable. Gas is because Russia provided gas of 20% that we use in the whole world. But because of this Ukrainian invasion, we can clearly understand that we are all affected in terms of food supply. Countries of Northwest Africa, like Morocco, Algeria, are affected in all directions, and even Malaysia in terms of food production. We can clearly understand that for the betterment of all, Putin should indeed pull out his troops out of Ukraine. Members of this house, comparing our world, we support harmony and peace. Why? Because when power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. What does this mean for the debate? We can clearly understand that how will this benefit all sides? Russian banks has been banned from the SWIFT international banking institution. Visa and MasterCard has banned transactions from Russia, sanction and lots more. But what happened? He is still striving. Why? Because war is what happens when peace talks, when language fails. But let's look at the impact that he causes to the world, but politically, economically, and socially, because he is a man that holds greater power in the whole world. That his invasion of Ukraine, that's the subjugation, is impacting the whole world, even including the greater United States of America, NATO, European Unions, and all directions and all parts of the world. Why? Because he is a good man in terms of politics. That's why we think that it is better that he pulls out his troops for the betterment of all individuals. Why? This is because... Can I have your point?
Yeah. So if you think that Putin is a benevolent actor, why would he, in the name of self-defense, would want to back out instead of trying to defend his country even more?
Members of this house, we can clearly understand that at the first place, Putin wants Ukraine that it should not join NATO. And what happens is that Ukraine is still insisting on joining NATO. What will happen if Ukraine will give up the pact that it will not join NATO? All things will be back to normal. Why? This is because we can clearly understand that addressing first on the point of the Deputy Prime Minister of the opposition, in which he states that he was not forced to pull his troops, but he was being forced. We can clearly understand that in terms of policy, the United States of America and other countries want to use Ukraine as a pathway, as a path gate, or to use it as a locator of missiles toward Russia. Why? This is because Putin feels unsecured and unsafe and says that I will not agree to that. Members of this house, comparing what does this mean for the debate? This debate goes to the side that supports and thinks about other people. This debate goes to the side that wishes peace for the world in terms of Putin's interests, because heroism at command, senseless brutality, how deplorable love for country stands, how ignoble war is. As said by Putin, I should rather be hacked to pieces than be a part of Soviets and action, but out of compelling, I must do that. It is based on all people's interests that it is in Putin's interest to pull out his troops out of Ukraine, because we don't want all countries to end. The impact and the benefit that surpasses the harm is better for all. Comparison with the opposition speech, because war brings massive casualties, destruction, and cause of everybody concerned. As the opposition have claimed that Putin will appear weak, immoralized, and all things, doesn't stand a chance in today's argument. Rather, we should consider other people of the whole world. At this juncture, I hope to propose. Thank you.
Putin rules with an iron fist.
He's a populist dictator, and these are descriptions of the Russian authoritarian leader or ruler that the government side conveniently dismisses in this entire debate. Right? They claim that Putin is such a benevolent actor, but we have POI'd them several times as to why exactly it would be in his best interest to actually pull troops out of Ukraine. Right? This means to say that whether Putin would actually do it or not, right? We tell you that the likelihood of him actually pulling his troops out are very low or essentially non-existent at all because of the fact that he is such a strongman leader, right? One glaring strategic flaw coming from government is that there was no setup at all coming on the interest of Putin alone, right? This is an actor debate wherein the actor is Putin, right? We tell you that at the point where they argued the interest of global entities rather than Putin, we take this debate. What we heard from them is that Putin should refrain from actually inserting troops on the basis that people are suffering, right? We could see that obviously people are suffering in terms of war, right? When there is an invasion on Ukraine, obviously people are suffering. However, this debate is not about whether war is principally moral, but rather just on the interest of Putin. At best, their case is later. At best, their case is about Putin just gaining respect out of remorse when he retreats, right? If they framed how exactly halting the atrocities that actually happened by pulling troops out would suddenly make Putin happy or left unsanctioned in his interest, maybe they would have at least a viable case. Instead, they continuously push the harms of war, which are inherently horrid at the end of the day, which is why we tell you that they're not actually debating the debate. Before I move on, yes.
Globally, all countries in the world are being affected because of this Ukrainian subjugation. That's why we think that it is based on interest that Putin should pull out his trade in Ukraine. What can you say as your operation opposing this? Please address the House fully.
Yes, exactly what I mentioned in the first 2 minutes of my speech. That is literally the interest on the whole world, on people who are actually suffering from this invasion. It's not in the interest of Putin exactly, right? Which is what this debate is about. But they never explained to us why Putin was harmed from invading Ukraine at the end of the day, right? We explained to you how as a strongman Putin has a reputation to uphold. We explained how as a leader of a state Putin has incentives to maintain the reputation in the eyes of these exact troops that allow his military to have actual strength, right? We tell you at the point where morale is gone, Russia's military strength weakens immensely. They never actually explain why Putin would want to risk that. This feeds into the exact harm of weakening his military presence, but also feeding into their case where they think that it's on the premise of security. They actually lose the ability to maintain this so-called security that they wanted to push in today's debate, right? We explained why exactly there is a huge likelihood that a Cold War would arise and be detrimental to a larger degree at the point where there is no military presence. We tell you that this is more than likely at the end of the day because you have Eastern Bloc states which back his expansionist regime. Yes.
Please, because of this problem that we are facing now, what can you say about the cold showers that are taking place in Germany because of the shortage of gas supply?
All right, we tell you then that's Germany's problem, that's not Putin's problem. That's the debate at the end of the day, right? Also, it seems as on a huge issue coming from their case, right? It seems as though Gov wants to justify the invasion of Ukraine based on a completely false premise of self-preservation, like I explained to you earlier, right? This claim is a double-edged sword panel because even on that premise of security and self-preservation, there is more incentive for these troops to remain because the best interest then is security. We tell you then because of the fact that the actual reason why we tell you that because of the fact that the actual reason why these troops are there in the first place is not because of security, but because of this expansionist regime that Putin wants to maintain and uphold, right? We tell you that because of this, the interest is then to maintain his strongman presence at the end of the day, right? We tell you that this debate is also about the interest of whether he would actually do it or not, which is again why their claim actually falls. A lot of the POIs coming from the from government is to ask me do you believe that all these countries are actually suffering from what Putin is doing? Do you feel it's justified as to whether Germany is suffering or not? We tell you that that's Germany's problem. We tell you that any harm coming from Russia's invasion or coming from Putin's dictatorship, essentially at the end of the day, is to feed into his whole interest as a strongman lead, as an authoritarian figure, right? We tell you why exactly when you remove his ability to have a proper military presence, he then loses the ability to maintain his strongman presence at the end of the day. Which is why we tell you that their entire claim falls because of the fact that they claim that Putin essentially wants to gain respect when he pulls troops out of Ukraine. But at the point where you actually even if Putin decides to pull troops out of Ukraine, we tell you that all the suffering all the harms of suffering that comes from Gulf essentially still is still there because Putin still has leverage in terms of actually still being supported by Eastern Bloc countries or Eastern Bloc states because of the fact that he has leverage in terms of gas and grain trade, right? We tell you that because of the fact that we explained to you why exactly Putin's interests are protected on our side of the house, or we just literally prove that Putin won't stop harming Ukraine or just won't stop won't just pull out their troops. We tell you we take this debate. But also the fact that war will still happen on our side of the house, just not in terms of physical military presence. We tell you that all the harms that occur on their side of the house will be continuous, right? They won't stop. There was no mechanization whatever, or no way to prove that all these harms would essentially stop on their side of the house. Which is why we understand that at the end of the day, suffering will still happen. Putin's interest will still be maintained. Putin's interest will still ensure that troops stay within these countries, and it is justified because of the fact that Putin is a strongman leader. We don't actually have to defend the burden of saying that suffering will end on our side of the house. For all those reasons, oppose.
Speed. Now let me invite opposition reply to wrap up opposition. Yeah.
If I get to prove that government's arguments are self-defeating according to the metrics that I put to you, and I provide to you the clarifications as well as to what clashes that we are taking, we think that we can take this debate. I think I do two things in my reply speech. Number one, I'll do a few clarifications. Number two, I'll tell you why on the metrics and how from the clashes that we got, we actually win this debate. I think number one, in terms of clarifications, I think there was a lot of problems in terms of the stances coming from side government. I think a few things is that they think in the first place that Russia is a benevolent actor. We already told you why Russia is not going to be a benevolent actor simply because of the trend into which how Putin has been acting in such a way to actually be having expansionist policies and being alliance with a lot of other countries that are also into the idea of being expansionist as well. We don't think they are also going to be the same people that's going to respect territory sovereignty. Yeah. So I think also it's in terms of I don't think they understand the burden that they're supposed to see. The burden into this debate is to see whether this is going to be the whether this is going to be something that Putin is going to do. It's not going to, this debate is not about legitimizing war. This wasn't our burden in the first place. I think the government doesn't understand and try to burden push us a different metrics that is not within this debate. That's quite clearly self-defeating in itself. So what is the second thing I do in terms of the metrics of this debate? To tell you why, according to former China analysis, why is it necessary? Why is it something within Putin's incentive for him to do so, and why in terms of allies as well, he will also do this, right? I think a few things here. So let's go through their argument that I will tell you why it's self-defeating. On their own circumstances as well, we already told to you why even in the best case scenario that Russia is only doing this because they want to self-defend themselves. This is something that's quite counterintuitive for you to do so. Hasibul already called it out. Alisha also said why is it something that's counterintuitive for you to do? Because if you wanted to defend your nation, that means it's less more likely for you to actually to pull out your troops, because that means you're agreeing to actually let your opponents to actually win the war at the end of the day. We talked to you why is it necessary for you to understand that panel. All of their arguments were things about why you should be legitimizing war in the first place. We don't think that's the point of this debate. We don't think that it actually clarifies into the two matrices that we have. which is number one on incentive, and number two and allies. But I think at number one, when it comes to incentive, we show to you two things. Number one, the circumstances that are surrounding Putin right now, i.e. from the economic sanctions that is actually working, and also in terms of like garnering support from the Eastern Bloc, are things that are actually like supporting and giving the incentive for Putin to continue on having his allies in Ukraine, in the Ukraine territories, right? But number two, when it comes to like being a populist leader in itself, we thought to you why there is incentive for him to continue on having his troops in Ukraine, because we think like he's not going to back down simply because it's something that's demoralizing for his own troops to do so. But on the second metric, when it comes to like whether this is going to be within his incentive to do so, is that in terms of allies and how it's going to apply in the international level, right? I think at one, when it comes to like his allies with China in itself, China is a prominent state that is known to be an authoritarian regime. They're supposed to be like that is populist as well. We don't and because they have this same principles of being a strongman regime, we don't think it's going to back down, because the ideology is the same, and this has been proven by Hezbollah to be said when like you don't actually want to back down because it makes you look weak. But number two, when it comes to the Eastern Bloc, we thought to you why there is incentive for him to actually stay, because you have people that has like the geopolitical advantage for him to stay, which is the Eastern Bloc, that is going to support him in the long run when it comes to like the Ukraine war. And I think like that is something that Ali Shah already clarified to you as well. And for these reasons, we take this debate.
The opposition reply to that part. Speech now, let me invite government reply to government speech as a whole. India.
Thank you.
Politics is a pendulum which swings between power and vision. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the day's government. This is probably my last speech here and the last speech of today's argument. So please listen. I have two things to mention now. We think that the opposition were quite distracted or carried away at our speeches, probably too amazed to listen at our mechanisms and quite clear here. Vladimir Putin would pull out his troops based on interest, and when he does that, the war will stop. The opposition also skipped the relevance and flip of their own debate. They failed to understand that when Putin pull out his troops, all these war are going to stop. Everything is going back to be normal. But all they did was just to call Putin an actor, a bad actor, a bad one, and all these people are going to suffer, and Putin just don't care. But we clarified very well. We also told the whole house on how this hurt our cases and defended theirs, but they failed to do that. All they did was just to favor their own side and not even see a good or a bad of their own side. All they did was just to see the bad of our side and not even a one thing that Ukraine did wrong. So this should be noted as well. The opposition failed to clarify to the whole house on how condemning Russia and also Putin will make Ukraine safer. All they did was just to condemn Putin. So also this should be clarified. The Prime Minister from the side government came out here quite wonderfully and told us how Vladimir Putin was good, and he puts his interest also to the interest of his people at fronts and not of other people. But the Prime Minister from the side proposition came out here and told us how Ukraine will ally with the United States and how Putin is a bad person and how the society will suffer, not considering what will happen to Russians. The Deputy Prime Minister from the government side came out here and told us quite wonderfully on how this affects the society and how Putin was hurt and how he was trying to defend himself. He was sitting and not trying to attack anyone, but only to protect his people. Because if he don't do that, what do they still call him? A bad leader, of course. And then people will still call him a bad leader and, I don't know, tarnish his image. Humans are never satisfied. Whatever you do to them, they'll always criticize you. While the Deputy Prime Minister from the opposition side came out here and told us stuff about they were actually committing a circular argument anyways. The prime minister said same, and the deputy prime minister, and that goes to the whip as well. So I believe that with this clarifications, we can see how the government, in this case, and the opposition drops their arguments aside. At this very point, I propose to propose. Thank you.
That's it today. Thank you for the wonderful speeches you have all given. We will ask time for the panel to deliberate and choose your person. Thank
Now? Now?